The rain was coming down in sheets that afternoon, the kind of relentless, heavy gray downpour that seems to wash the color right out of the city streets. It was a Tuesday, a day that usually blurred into the background of my week, filled with the rhythmic, predictable cadence of errands and domestic management. My husband, Mark, had left his portfolio at home, a thick, leather-bound case containing the blueprints for the new municipal library project he had been agonizing over for months. He had called me in a panic, his voice tight with stress, asking if I could drive it into the city. I agreed, of course. It was what we did. We supported each other, functioning like two perfectly meshed gears in a machine that had been running smoothly, if somewhat monotonously, for nearly a decade. I remember the drive vividly, the windshield wipers slapped back and forth, a metronome counting down the minutes. When I arrived at the firm, a towering structure of glass and steel that reflected the stormy sky, I shook off my umbrella in the lobby, feeling small against the polished marble floors and the vaulted ceiling. The receptionist knew me by face, offering a polite, practiced smile as she buzzed me through to the elevators. I pressed the button for the 42nd floor, watching the numbers climb, my ears popping slightly as the world below fell away. Usually, Mark met me at the elevator banks, breathless and grateful, taking the portfolio with a quick kiss on the cheek before rushing back to the conference room. But that day, the hall was empty. The floor was quiet, an eerie, hushed silence that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm breaks. I walked down the corridor toward his office, my heels sinking into the plush, dark carpet, making no sound. His door was open, but Mark wasn't there. Standing by the window, looking out at the curtain of rain obscuring the skyline, was a man I had only seen in passing at holiday parties or in fleeting introductions. It was Julian, the senior partner of the firm. He was a man of legend in Mark's stories, brilliant, intimidating, a visionary architect who supposedly cared more about structural integrity than human interaction. I hesitated in the doorway, gripping the handle of the wet portfolio, suddenly feeling like an intruder in a sanctuary. I considered turning around, leaving the case on the assistant's desk and slipping away unseen. But before I could move, he turned. He didn't startle, he didn't jump, he simply pivoted with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he'd known I was there the moment I stepped off the elevator. "Elena," he said. It wasn't a question. He knew who I was. His voice was deeper than I remembered, resonant like a cello string plucked in an empty room. Mark is in the boardroom downstairs. He's likely pacing a hole in the floor, wondering where his drawings are. "I should go down there then," I said, though my feet didn't move. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You aren't disturbing me," Julian replied, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his mouth. He gestured toward the chair opposite his desk. "Wait here. I'll have his assistant run the portfolio down. No need for you to get caught in the crossfire of a panicked design team." There was an authority in his tone that was impossible to resist, yet it wasn't commanding. It was inviting. It was a shelter offered in the middle of a storm. I walked into the room, and the atmosphere shifted. The air here smelled of graphite, old paper, and something distinct, like cedar wood and rain. His office was not the sterile modern box I expected. It was a library of curiosity. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with books, not just on architecture, but on philosophy, history, and art. There were framed sketches of bridges that were never built, and a drafting table in the corner that looked like it had seen 50 years of work. I handed the portfolio to the young assistant who appeared at the door a moment later. And then, strangely, I stayed. Julian sat on the edge of his massive oak desk, crossing his arms, looking at me. Not through me, not past me, but at me. It is a rare thing, I realized in that moment, to be truly looked at. Most people scan you. They register your presence, your utility, or your relation to them. Julian looked at me, as if he were studying the structural composition of a building, searching for the load-bearing walls. "He tells me you used to paint," he said softly. The question hung in the air, surprising me. Mark rarely spoke about my past hobbies to his colleagues. "I did, a long time ago," I admitted, shifting in the leather chair. "Before life got busy, before the practicalities took over." "Practicality," Julian mused, turning to look out at the rain-streaked window again. "The enemy of the sublime. We build structures to house people, to keep them safe, to be practical. But we design them to make people feel something. If a building doesn't make you look up and catch your breath, it's just a box. I imagine a life without art is much the same. Just a box." I felt a sudden sharp ache in my chest, a resonance that vibrated against ribs I hadn't realized were guarding anything. "It's easy to forget to look at the ground, watching where you step." He looked back at me, his eyes dark and intelligent. "And what happens when you stop looking down, Elena?" The conversation that followed wasn't long. Perhaps 20 minutes, but it felt like it existed out of time. We didn't talk about the weather, or the traffic, or the mundane details of Mark's project. We talked about the quality of light in the room, the way the rain distorted the city into an impressionist painting, the weight of silence. He spoke to me not as a subordinate's wife, but as an equal, a mind capable of understanding the nuances he was putting into words. When I finally stood to leave, the rain had slowed to a drizzle. "Thank you for the shelter," I said, feeling a strange flush on my cheeks. "The door is always open," he replied. "Sometimes the quiet is hard to find." I drove home in a daze. The radio was playing, but I didn't hear it. My mind kept replaying the timbre of his voice, the way the light from his disc lamp caught the silver in his hair, the absolute stillness of his presence. It wasn't a romantic infatuation. I loved Mark, and I was committed to our life. This was different. It was an intellectual awakening. It was the feeling of a dormant part of my brain, a part that dealt in metaphors and shadows and beauty, suddenly snapping back online after years of idling in sleep mode. Mark came home late that night, exhausted and triumphant. The meeting had gone well. He kissed me distractedly, thanked me for the portfolio, and collapsed onto the sofa to check his emails. I sat in the kitchen, watching him, feeling a surge of affection, but also a profound sense of distance. He was here, but he was also miles away, lost in the logistics of his career. I realized then that I was lonely. Not for company. I had friends, I had Mark, but for recognition. I was lonely for someone who wondered what I was thinking, not just what I was doing. A week later, I found myself back at the building. I told myself it was necessary. There were tickets to a charity gala that Mark needed to sign for, documents that couldn't wait for the courier. But as I walked across the lobby, I knew I was lying to myself. I wasn't there for the signature. I was there for the atmosphere of that office. I was chasing the feeling of being seen. When I arrived at Julian's door, he was on the phone, his back to the entrance. He held a fountain pen, tapping it rhythmically on a notepad. I turned to leave, not wanting to interrupt him, but he spun his chair around, caught my eye, and held up a hand, signaling me to stay. He ended the call abruptly, hanging up with a sigh that seemed to expel the frustration of the business world. "You returned," he said, a genuine warmth flooding his expression. It wasn't a flirtatious smile. It was the look of a man who had found a rare book he thought he had lost. "I have papers for Mark." I lifted the envelope as if it were a shield. "Mark is on site in the chaotic depths of Midtown, but you can leave them here, or you can have a cup of coffee with me and tell me why you stopped painting." I sat. The coffee was dark and bitter, exactly how I liked it, served in ceramic mugs that felt heavy and handmade. The sunlight was different that day, streaming in through the clouds in shafts of gold that illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air. I didn't stop because I wanted to. I found myself saying, the words tumbling out before I could check them. I stopped because I ran out of things to say, or maybe I just stopped believing that anyone wanted to hear them. Painting.
"My grandfather drew this," he said quietly. "He never finished it. The war started and he was drafted. He never came back. I keep it here to remind myself that the work we don't do haunts us more than the work we mess up." I traced the lines of the drawing with my fingertip, feeling the roughness of the paper. "It's beautiful, even if it's incomplete," I whispered. "Perhaps," Julian said, his voice dropping an octave, turning the air between us thick and charged. "But think of the tragedy of the potential. You are full of potential, Elena. I can see it in the way you observe this room. You notice the shadows. You notice the texture. You are an artist pretending to be a spectator." My heart hammered against my ribs. It wasn't fear. It was the thrill of being exposed, of having someone peel back the layers of wife and housekeeper and support system to reveal the person underneath. We talked for an hour that day. We discussed fear. We discussed the concept of legacy. We discussed the way the light hits the water at sunset. When I left, I felt lightheaded, as if I had consumed too much oxygen after holding my breath for years. The elevator ride down felt like a descent from a mountain peak. The noise of the street below, the taxis, the shouting construction workers, the sirens, assaulted my senses. I wanted to turn around and go back up to the silence, to the cedar-scented air, to the man who asked me questions that mattered. The third time I went, I didn't even have an excuse. Mark was out of town for a conference. I was alone in the city. I drove to the firm in the late afternoon, during that magic hour when the sun turns the glass buildings into pillars of fire. I told the receptionist I was looking for a book Mark had left behind. She didn't question me. I knocked softly on Julian's doorframe. He was working at his drafting table, his sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms dusted with charcoal. He looked up, and for a moment, the air left the room. There was no pretense this time. He knew why I was there. I knew why I was there. "I was hoping you would come," he said simply. He didn't offer me coffee this time. He walked over to the window and stood looking out at the sprawling metropolis. I joined him, standing close enough to feel the heat radiating from his suit jacket, but not touching. The tension was palpable, a magnetic pull that felt dangerous and vital all at once. "I feel like I'm waking up," I confessed, speaking to the glass rather than to him. "For years, I've been sleepwalking, doing everything right, checking every box, and suddenly I'm awake, and I realize how hungry I am." Julian turned to face me. "Hunger is a good thing, Elena. It means you're alive. Most people are just content. They are full on empty calories. But you want the feast." He reached out, his hand hovering for a split second before he gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers brushed my temple, a touch that lasted less than a second but seared itself into my memory. It wasn't sexual in the way that a sordid affair is sexual. It was tender. It was a recognition of existence. It was a touch that said, "I see you. You are real." You deserve to be understood, not just loved. Loved is easy. Understood is rare. Don't settle for a life where you aren't understood. We stood there as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the office in shades of violet and indigo. We didn't cross the line. There was no kiss, no embrace that would shatter the vows I had made. But in that silence, in that shared twilight, an intimacy was forged that was deeper than anything physical. I gave him my fears, my dreams, my dormant creativity. He gave me his attention, his wisdom, his validation. I left that evening with a sense of profound peace. I realized that I hadn't fallen in love with Julian, not in the way that would destroy my marriage. I had fallen in love with the version of myself that he reflected back to me. He was a mirror, polished and clear, showing me the woman I had forgotten I could be. Days turned into weeks. I didn't go back to the office. I didn't need to. The awakening had happened. I went to an art supply store and bought a canvas. I bought paints, oils, smelling of linseed and turpentine. I set up a studio in the spare room. When Mark came home, he found me covered in paint, a smudge of blue on my cheek, working on a landscape of a storm over a city. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time in months. "You haven't seen you do this in years," he said, a note of awe in his voice. "I know," I said, smiling at him, feeling a new strength in my spine. I missed her. Mark didn't ask who her was. He just kissed my forehead and watched me work. The dynamic in our house shifted. I was no longer just the supporting character in his drama. I was the protagonist of my own. And strangely, our marriage improved. Because I was fuller, I had more to give. I wasn't resentful of his work because I had my own. 2 months later, the firm held its annual gala at the breathless height of the City Museum. The room was filled with people in tuxedos and gowns, clutching flutes of champagne, the murmur of conversation rising like a tide. I wore a dress of deep emerald green, a color I had chosen because it made me feel bold. I saw Julian across the room almost immediately. He was surrounded by a group of investors, holding court with that same quiet, magnetic confidence. He looked up, his eyes scanning the crowd, and they locked onto mine. The world seemed to slow down. The noise of the party faded into a dull hum. Across the 20 feet of marble floor that separated us, a silent conversation passed between us. "Thank you," I thought. "You're welcome," his eyes seemed to reply. He didn't come over. He didn't make a scene. He simply nodded, a slow, respectful inclination of his head. It was a salute, a closure, an acknowledgement of the secret world we had briefly inhabited together in that office high above the rain. Mark appeared at my side, sliding his arm around my waist. "There's Julian," he said, pointing with his glass. "I should go say hello. Do you want to come?" I looked at Julian one last time, watching as he turned back to his conversation, a solitary figure of strength and intellect. "No," I said softly, turning to my husband with a smile that reached my eyes. "I think I'll stay here. I'm just going to enjoy the view." I watched Mark walk away, feeling a profound sense of gratitude. Life, I realized, is not just about the paths we choose and the straight lines we walk. It is also about the intersections, the unexpected stops, the people who offer us shelter when we didn't know we were wet. Julian was a chapter in my story, not the whole book, but he was the chapter where the plot twisted, where the character found her voice. I took a sip of champagne, the bubbles sharp and bright on my tongue. I looked out the museum window at the city lights sprawling to the horizon. a chaotic, beautiful, structured mess of potential. I wasn't just looking at the ground anymore. I was looking up. The music of the quartet swelled, a beautiful, melancholic cello line rising above the violins. It reminded me of his voice. I closed my eyes for a fleeting second, letting the memory of the cedar-scented office wash over me one last time, and then I let it go. I opened my eyes, turned back to the party, and stepped forward into the rest of my life, fully awake, fully seen, and finally, completely myself. That night, the drive home was different. The silence in the car wasn't empty. It was companionable. Mark held my hand as he drove, his thumb tracing circles on my skin. "You know," he hesitated, "I was watching you across the room when you were looking at the paintings. You looked like radiant. It reminded me of when we first met. You had that same spark." I squeezed his hand. "I found it again." "I'm glad," he said, and I could hear the honesty in his voice. "I missed it too." We arrived home. The house stood quiet and welcoming in the moonlight. As I walked through the hallway, I glanced into the spare room, my studio. The moonlight fell across the easel, illuminating the canvas I had been working on. It was a painting of a window, rain-streaked and blurred, but through the glass, you could see a single bright light burning in the distance.